Focus today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson. Of course, the economy continues to be a big question mark these days. How bad is it? Can it improve? What are President-elect Trump's plans? I am very honored to have back with us today Thomas J. DiLorenzo. He is the president of Mises Institute, a nonprofit organization that exists to promote teaching and research in Australian School of Economy or Economics and individual freedom, honest in history, and international peace. He's also the author of a fascinating read called Hamilton's Curse: How Jefferson's Arch Enemy Betrayed the American Revolution and What It Means for Americans Today. He does have and there's a picture of the cover of the book on the screen, and Mises is mises.org, and there's the picture of the landing page. Thomas, good to see you again, friend. How are you?
Good to see you again too, Perry. Doing fine.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. We appreciate it. Okay, I think we can boil it down to one question. How bad of an economy is President Trump inheriting?
Well, as is typical of the Democrats, they're on a wild spending spree, and it's the very end now for them. And so I assume they're shoving money out the door as fast as they can, kind of like putting coal into a furnace. And so, I think we have a bubble in the stock market again, a bubble in real estate in some cities, a bubble in college tuition, a bubble in the car market, and no one can forecast when the bubble might burst, or bubbles. But that's the situation we're in. One good thing, though, is there was so much tremendous uncertainty over whether we would continue on this road or President Trump would win the election. And now we know there's no longer the uncertainty. We know President Trump pretty well. He's been in office for 4 years before. We know what he believes in. And I think just that is good news, because businesses, even if the economy is not so hot, they don't like uncertainty. They need to plan, and now they can plan. They have a much better idea of what's coming, and so that's a little bit of good news.
How accurate are the inflation numbers?
I don't think they're very accurate at all. If you go on a website called shadowstats.com, they use the formula that the government used in the 1980s to calculate inflation. And they say it's more like 10 to 15% today, not the 3% that the government claims it is. And of course, that's an aggregate, the consumer price index. That means, well, depending on your lifestyle and the things that you buy, the things you spend money on, some people might have a lower inflation rate and individually, and some much higher, depending on how you spend your money. And so I think the inflation rate is much higher than the government tells us, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody.
Why did the CPI not include energy and food anymore?
Yeah, because it makes the government look bad. Joe Biden and the Democrats, the first thing they did was shut down these big pipelines, oil pipelines, and they tried to wage a war on energy in the name of climate change, which is sort of a euphemism for socialism, as far as I'm concerned. And so, I can remember the very beginning of the Biden administration, his energy secretary was on one of the big news shows, Meet the Press or one of those, and the commentator asked her, "What can you do? What can the government do to bring down energy prices?" And she laughed. She laughed, a big joke. And I took that as she meant, well, we don't want to bring down energy prices. We want people to drive less, use less energy, save the planet, climate change. And she just laughed at him. And so, and that's going to be a dramatic change, because, as you know, President Trump, doesn't fall for that. He wants us to have a vigorous economy, and we might even incredibly move more in the direction of nuclear power, which is the cleanest type of power. France generates almost all of its electricity by nuclear, and so there would be no debate over pollution if we succeeded in doing that. And so, and food prices, of course, they've escalated food prices because the A lot of the politicians are in the pockets of the big agricultural corporations, just like they're in the pockets of the big pharmaceutical corporations and the military-industrial complex. And so that's what we get. We get more expensive food, and so the politicians want to gather all the credit and the campaign donations they can from these big industries, but they don't want to catch the heat from us consumers who are saying, why is food so expensive? Why is gas so expensive? So they lie to us.
What role did the Federal Reserve play in this, and how they managed interest rates with the inflation problem?
Well, the Federal Reserve is the main cause of the higher prices. Whenever we have inflation, it's caused by the Federal Reserve. It's not caused by oil companies or farmers or anybody else who the politicians blame. It's caused by the politicians and their bank, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has a monopoly control of the money supply of the United States. And the same is true of every other government that in the world that has what's called a central bank. And so they're behind it all, and they're always looking for scapegoats. It's always easy to convince a lot of people that greedy business people are behind higher prices. But greedy business people are always greedy. And when the inflation rate is 2%, they're just as greedy as they are when it's 10%. And so they don't have the ability to make the inflation go from 2% to 10%. But the Fed does, and only the Fed does. And so that's why we need to control the Fed. And one thing the Fed does, by the way, is in the 1930s, it was given the power to basically counterfeit money and use the money to buy government bonds from banks, mostly the big banks like Goldman Sachs, big investment banks. And that puts that money, billions and billions of dollars, into circulation into the banking system. And when they start lending it out, that's what fuels demand, more demand in the economy, and that's what creates the inflation. But we should be experiencing deflation with all the tremendous technological advance with AI and everything else that's going on, and it has been going on for a long time. And the only reason we don't see lower energy prices and food prices is the Fed keeps pumping so much money into circulation to pay for all these government programs, the military state as well as the welfare state and everything else. The Fed is a major financier of all of it, including bailouts to banks who make foolish decisions on their investments, like they did in 2008 and with the great crash of '08.
So President Trump won't be able to change the leadership of the Fed because that is an uninterrupted term. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the Fed chairman is appointed to a certain term, and I think he has another year and a half or so in his term, and so President Trump can't fire him. Yeah, isn't that something? He's the president, and he can't. There's one bureaucrat that he can't fire. He can appoint the new one when he's done. When Powell is finished, President Trump will appoint a replacement. And I would hope he would appoint him with someone like Steve Moore, for example, who, by the way, was a student of mine at George Mason University in the 80s. And President Trump appointed him the first time he was president, but he didn't make it to the Board of Governors of the Fed. But he should make someone like him the chairman of the Fed, and that would make a very, very good improvement.
Thomas, I have to ask the question, do we need the Feds?
No, we don't need the Fed. We went for, well, what was it, 174 years, I think it was, without the Fed. And we had three central banks before that. One was called the Bank of North America, and nobody trusted its money, so it went out of business in about a year and a half. This is in George Washington's day. And then they created something called the Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton was the creator of that. That lasted 20 years, and it created so many boom and bust cycles and inflation and unemployment that Congress did not recharter it. Then it was brought back again to help finance the War of 1812, and it did the same thing. It harmed the economy, made it unstable, corrupted politics, and so President Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of the second bank of the United States. So we have three central banks, and so we went basically from 1840 until 1913 without a Fed, without a central bank. And that includes the post-Civil War era, which is probably the most prosperous era in American history. It was the Industrial Revolution in America, that whole period. And so we did very well. And the banking industry didn't like competition. And so they wanted basically an organization that would be sort of a cartel manager for the bankers to make sure there's not too much competition.
Could it be eliminated?
Well, the first step was this law that was passed in the 1930s would be to prohibit the Fed from counterfeiting money to buy government bonds, and that's how, like I said, that's how they call it the monetization of the debt. When the government borrows money, that's how it's monetized, so to speak. So when you read these statistics of the national debt being $32 trillion, that's how that came about, and that could be ended. The government of Argentina is proposing to do just that, and President Milei has actually been looking into a law to make it illegal to do that for any government agency to monetize the debt in that way. And he's threatening to put people in prison for doing what the Fed chairman, our Fed chairman, does today. I don't know if they'll go to that extreme, but it's a good idea to get them, the central bank of Argentina, out of the business of monetizing the Fed, which is a fancy word for creating inflation. And inflation is a regressive tax. The poor people hurt the worst. The millionaires, they can handle 10% inflation, but somebody who makes $35,000 a year, that's going to hurt. And so it's a good thing to do. Just for that reason alone, it's a good thing to do. And we had competing currencies before in America. A lot of people think Bitcoin is a competing currency. I'm not personally convinced of that because it's not a very good store of value. I wouldn't put my life savings in Bitcoin. I don't know too many people who would, but we used to have competing currencies. They were driven out of the market during the Civil War, and after the Civil War with taxes, they were taxed so that the greenback dollar that we now use today could be the monopoly money that we have.
I was going to come to that, but let's stick there. So given the strength of the dollar and the rise of cryptocurrency, where do you think this ends up?
Well, the dollar is in trouble, has been in trouble for a long time. And evidence of that is like a lot of the people who are sort of part of the foreign policy establishment are very frightened about this, because when we pose sanctions on dozens of institutions and countries and individuals on our foreign policy, we use the dollar as a weapon because they hold dollars. Countries all over the world hold many billions of dollars, and so we freeze them. We won't accept them and things like that. And so the foreign policy establishment is shaking in their boots that the decline of the dollar will take that tool away from them. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that we know it's in trouble because the foreign establishment of America is worried, very worried about this, because it takes that tool away from them. And so, but I think it's a good thing. It'll reduce military adventurism. And maybe our foreign policy establishment will decide someday that their main purpose should be defending America and Americans, and not being all over the globe for doing God knows what in Africa and all over the place. And so I think that would be a good thing.
All right, let me take a quick break. This is so fascinating. By the way, Mises.org is the website, mises.org. We'll come back. We'll talk to him a little about that. Check out his book called The Hamilton Curse, and there's a picture of the cover of the book there. We'll check in with him on that when we come back. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, and what an honor to have back with us today Thomas J. DiLorenzo. He's the president of Mises Institute. We're going to talk to him about that. His book is a must-read called The Hamilton's Curse, and there's a picture of the cover of the book. And check that out. And then it does have a website, Mises.org, which is MISES.org. And there's the picture of the landing page. So, Thomas, before I get to the Institute and the book, just a couple more quick questions. Any idea the approach to monetary policy by Donald Trump versus the current administration?
Well, President Trump, he's a real estate developer, and all the real estate developers all want lower interest rates. But our position is interest rates should be determined by supply and demand for loanable funds, just like everything else, just like the price of eggs and the price of milk is determined by supply and demand on the marketplace. And it shouldn't be tinkered around with a sort of a central planning mindset of the Fed. And anybody who takes Econ 101 is taught in the first week or two that price controls are a bad idea. And so, but then here we have the Fed that employs about 500 economists. And what do? Price control. They're trying to constantly manipulating interest rates. And so that has to stop. That should stop. Wall Street speculators make a lot of money on that because the fluctuating interest rates creates arbitrage opportunities for them. But the Fed, the bottom line of the Fed, it creates inflation for everybody else and periodic depressions. Like every decade, we have one or two of these incidents, and it's all created by the Fed's bubbles created. It's the beginning. In the very first one, the Fed was created in 1913, and we had a Great Depression of 1920. It only lasted a year because the government retrenched, cut taxes, cut spending, cut borrowing, and the business community pulled us out of it in 1920. Didn't do that in 10 years later because we had massive government intervention, and that led to a 15-year-long Great Depression back then. And so but President Trump had good, sound judgment in appointing Judy Shelton and Steve Moore to the Board of Governors of the Fed. They didn't make it. They were sabotaged by the Democrats. But I think people like that who have a much better understanding of economics, after all, Biden's chief economic advisor was a music major in college. He was a music teacher, and he puts this guy in the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And President Trump will not do something so foolish.
Is it possible, Thomas, that if President Trump delivers the revolutionary economy that he's talking about, he gets the price of energy down, it spars this huge economic burst, does that kind of corner the Feds? What do they do if things are good?
Well, that's a problem of every government agency, isn't it? If poverty disappears, what's the Health and Human Services going to do? If there's no war, what's the Pentagon going to do? And on and on. And so they're constantly trying to create the perception of some kind of crisis because that justifies their jobs. That's an eternal battle that we must have. That's why institutions like the Mises Institute do our best to educate as many people as possible about what's really going on here. And you're right, and as far as Elon Musk and Vivek hoping to deregulate large portions of the economy. Every business in America spends a big portion of every day just complying with government regulations. If that can be cut by 10% and let people have another 10% of actually working and producing things rather than dealing with paperwork and lawyers and government bureaucrats, that could be a huge productivity boom, even more important than the lower energy prices. And so that's a big possibility of the route we might take in the future if they succeed, if Musk and Vivek succeed in getting some serious deregulation done. You might remember the deregulation under President Carter. Rest in peace. That was tremendously beneficial for the airline industry being deregulated. Oil was deregulated. We have very cheap gas prices, and that helped cause the boom of the 1980s.
Yeah, that's a hot button with me. I mean, if all the people in communication and media, only broadcast is regulated, and we're almost regulated to death.
Yes, yes. Well, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, he basically had one big monopoly of all the media because they used the regulators to threaten their licenses if they didn't support the New Deal, and so he established that kind of procedure. I'm not saying all presidents do that, but he was probably the worst in that regard.
Let me go to the Institute before we run out of time, because it's an amazing organization and what you're doing there. Tell us about it and how people can get involved.
Well, check out our website, Mises.org, MISES.org, and it's a great treasure trove of free education on economics. We have dozens and dozens of great books to be downloaded. Some of them are downloaded 40 or 50,000 times a month. Some of our books. We give away free books. We have a summer school for students. If you have a college student in the family or a friend, check out our Mises University. It's sort of a week-long boot camp in the summer of brilliant, usually 150 or so brilliant young people from all over the world come here to Auburn, Alabama, and learn free market economics. We publish books and we hold conferences, and you can check all of those out. We have literally thousands of videos of lectures and other things, and some of them have over 1 million views on YouTube or our website. And so I think it's the best economics website in the world, and it's all understandable. It's not convoluted like so many economic websites are.
That's MISES.org. The website, check it out, go there and get involved and sign up. MISES.org. Well, Thomas, what do you want people to get from your book on the Hamilton's Curse?
Well, Alexander Hamilton was the real founding father of big government in America. He was Thomas Jefferson's nemesis in his day, and Jefferson was, that government is best which governs least was his philosophy. That's a direct quote from Jefferson. And so it was Hamilton who favored a central bank, what we today call corporate welfare. It was Hamilton who invented the idea of implied powers of the Constitution, the whole idea of a living Constitution. That came from Hamilton, and legal scholars from that day on used his arguments to basically water down and destroy constitutional limits on government. And so that's why, by the way, the left idolizes Hamilton with this stupid play on Broadway, for example, and a lot of books praising him to the treetops while criticizing Jefferson at the same time. And so that's in a nutshell is why I called it Hamilton's Curse. There's another book out there called Hamilton's Blessing. Hamilton once said a large public debt would be a blessing because the rich people of the country would own the government bonds, and they would be a lobbying force for higher taxes and bigger government to make sure there was enough money in the Treasury to pay off their bonds. And so he was very Machiavellian, very, very conniving in that regard politically.
Interesting. All right. It's called The Hamilton's Curse there by Thomas J. DiLorenzo. You can check that out. There's a picture of the cover of the book. A couple of questions kind of off course here a little bit on the sidelines. What is your take of what's happened to our judicial system, better known as lawfare?
Well, there's been a movement. I was a university professor for 41 years before I became president of the Mises Institute, and in the university world, there's been maybe for the last 30 or 40 years, sort of a Marxist takeover of parts of law schools. They call it critical theory, and critical. And I've talked to a lot of these people over the years, and I asked them, well, criticize what? And basically everything. We want to destroy everything, burn it all down, and start from that. Socialists have always had that kind of mindset, and so they see what they're doing. Trying to put President Trump in jail and literally putting some of his appointees in jail. They did go to prison for refusing subpoenas, for example, things like that. They think the ends justify the means. The ends always justify the means with the left. And if that means destroying our legal system, then so be it. That's their mindset. If that means destroying the Constitution, then so be it. The dean of the law school at the University of California, Berkeley, a couple of months ago, said we need to just scrap the whole Constitution altogether. And so he's an honest man. He came out and said it, but they all believe that, all the Marxist left in the law schools. And I think that's where this comes from. And I'm hoping that President Trump's election will eliminate much of the wokeism and this craziness. And people are realizing, you do this, you're not only corrupting the legal system, but you're not enforcing the law against real criminals.
Yeah.
And so, the defund the police movement, apparently in California, there's also a defund the fire department movement in Los Angeles. And I wonder how many other cities have done this, have defunded their fire departments. I mean, it's an interesting question, because I can't remember a bigger catastrophe in my lifetime of what has happened to these people in Los Angeles with the thousands of homes destroyed.
One last question. What's your take on the handling of COVID?
Well, the handling of COVID, at the very beginning of it, I was asking my friends, when did we become the Soviet Union? I think it was a giant fraud perpetrated on the world, and I think the main reason for it was to get rid of Donald Trump. That's, before COVID, unemployment rate was historically low, and Trump's people were going out just murdering the Democrats on saying the lowest unemployment, black unemployment in history, the lowest female unemployment, the lowest Hispanic unemployment in history, and they were just beating them to death with that. But then by April of 2020, the unemployment rate was 50%. And I think that was a large part of why this happened. And also a large part of why this happened was President Trump had proposed reducing the budget of the Centers for Disease Control by several $1 billion. And this was their response to create a pandemic.
Yeah.
And we now know that those paper masks were useless. We now know that all these people, like my brother-in-law who lost his job because he refused to take the shots, the Supreme Court said, no, that was wrong. They should be compensated for that. And so it was a trial run in totalitarianism is what it was. And we should never fall for it again.
Professor, you're fascinating. Thank you for your time. Hopefully we can have you back often. Let me say to our viewers and listeners a couple of things. Check out the Institute's website, mises.org. There's a picture of that landing page. Take advantage of all the resources that are there and maybe sign up. And then check out the book, Hamilton's Curse. There's a picture of the cover of the book on the page. Professor, thank you, my friend. God bless you. Stay in the fight.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You too.
You're welcome.